We're going to concentrate for the seedless vascular plants on ferns. It's a pretty big group of plants that don't make seeds but do make spores. And when we talk about their leaves, we call them fronds. So you can see in this photograph at the bottom, you've got kind of a long frond that has a bunch of smaller leaflets on it. That's common in the ferns, okay? Now remember, you have a gametophyte and a sporophyte generation in all of these different plants. And in the fern, the gametophyte is non-dominant, and so it's dependent on water for fertilization. So we still have in ferns sperm swimming to egg for fertilization, so water is important. And so most of the time you're going to find these in kind of moist environments. So if we look at this life cycle, which I'm not going to have you label a life cycle or anything for a test, but hopefully you can recognize the fern up here at the top, which would be the sporophyte generation. And so if it's a sporophyte, then it's going to be making spores, and you can see that there are these sori on the back of the leaves that produce the spores, and when the spores germinate, you make the gametophyte generation, which is right here. It's microscopic, but it has both male and female parts on it, and so it will have the sperm producing parts and the egg producing parts on here, and some fertilization happens and you produce your sporophyte, which grows into the next generation. So just to kind of illustrate that scientists aren't always just in their labs doing research. A lab from the University of North Carolina, they study ferns. They discovered a couple of new species of ferns, and because they were fans of Lady Gaga, they chose to give the scientific name based on her name rather than based on their name, which was kind of interesting. This is the fern gametophyte for that particular species, and they thought it looked a lot like one of her costumes. So I'm going to want you to be able to recognize these three parts for the ferns. The fiddlehead is going to be the early fern that's coming up from the ground. And that is something that's actually sold in farmers markets and people eat them. The frond we've already talked about is the whole set of leaves. And then on the back of the frond, you see these little tiny brown dots. Those aren't bugs or anything. Those are actually the sori, which are where the spores are produced. So there are uses for these type of plants. Of course, they're ornamental, and people use them in their homes, in their backyard. You see them in businesses growing in pots and things like that. So that's a pretty big commercial use. If we look at ferns in some of the tropical rainforests, they do get larger than the ferns that you would see here. And so they actually do develop a little bit of a trunk. And because they live in a tropical rainforest where there's lots of insects and lots of fungal species, they do have to worry a little bit about decomposition and decay, and so they produce chemicals that keep them from being decomposed, and that makes them a good choice for building materials. So we already talked about the fiddleheads. You can see them here. They're cooked in many different ways. And then we do have a bunch of them that have some type of a medicinal value. These are more likely used in kind of home remedies, but astringents, they dry things out a little bit. Arthritis, of course, is problems with joints, and there are supplements coming from ferns that are used for that, for cough, for asthma, many other uses too. So just as long as you realize that they do have uses other than for building or other than for just ornamental. Okay, so the next step up would be the seed plant. So we've gone from the mosses who have no vascular tissue to the ferns who have vascular tissue but no seeds, and then to the seed plants which have vascular tissue and also make seeds. And so these are the most common and the most advanced of all of the plants that we find on our planet. We're going to look at quickly at the seed. There's 3 parts to the seed. The embryo, which is going to grow to the new generation, the stored food within the seed for the embryo, and then the seed coat, which is for protection. So you can see on the left a drawing and on the right a photograph of a seed. So I don't know if you really think about this if you eat seeds like beans or corn or whatever, but inside that seed is a little embryo. So it has a seed root, has seed leaves, okay? All of this part here is the stored food, the endosperm, because the seed, when you plant it, is underground, so it's not going, the little embryo is not doing photosynthesis, so it's dependent on that food. And then the seed coat is just for protection. So just like all of the other plant groups that we've looked at, we have gametophytes and sporophytes. And in seed plants, of course, the gametophyte is non-dominant. It's haploid. It makes gametes. But we have 2 kinds. So you'll have a male gametophyte and a female gametophyte, both microscopic. And so for the male part, the pollen grain is the male gametophyte, and it's what produces the sperm. And pollen grains are important too because they are resistant to drying out and getting too hot, and so they're going to make it even if environmental conditions aren't very good, and they'll be able to germinate on the female part when the environmental conditions are better. So the female gametophyte is going to be within the ovule. So we haven't really looked at pictures of this yet, but down here at the bottom, this is the ovule within the flower of a seed plant, and within that is the egg. And so when the pollen grain flies to the female part of the plant and lands on the female part, it's going to produce a tube, pollen tube. The sperm are going to swim out, and then they're going to be able to fertilize the egg. So again, another life cycle. I'm not worried that you are able to label a whole life cycle. But if we look at a pine tree, which I'm assuming that you recognize a pine tree, the tree itself is the sporophyte, okay? It produces cones, and within these cones are the gametophytes. And so we have the female cone, which has the ovule with the egg, and then we have the male cone, which produces the pollen. And so the pollen lands here on this part that leads down into the egg. Fertilization happens. You make yourself a seed. You plant the seed, and you make a new generation of plant. Okay, and you can see in this pine that the pine seed has all those parts that we talked about when we were looking at like a bean seed. So when we look at the seed plants, there's 2 groups of seed plants. There's the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this in terms of how they're classified and how they're characterized. But in the gymnosperm, the ovule, which is where the egg is made, is not completely enclosed by the sporophyte tissue. So it's basically open to the environment. And that's different from the angiosperm, which has the ovule completely enclosed, and so it's a little bit more protected. It's enclosed by the ovary. So we have looked at this picture already, but just so you're thinking about the female part and the male part. Those are the gametophytes, and they make the sperm and they make the egg. And then if we look at it in terms of a life cycle, we've already looked at one of these pine life cycles, so this is one you can just go back and look at in your book, just to make sure that you feel comfortable about the parts that we have discussed.